Officer,
Afternoon. I need your driver's license and ID. This car matches a stolen vehicle report.
do you even know who you're talking to?
I don't care who you are. Hand over the license now or this gets worse.
Worse? For me? Look closely.
Police captain.
The body camera footage would later show exactly what happened on September 14, 2025, just outside a quiet residential neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina. A clear afternoon, calm streets, the kind of suburban block where the loudest thing happening at 2:23 p.m. on a weekday is a lawnmower 2 houses down. A black man sits calmly in the driver's seat of a dark gray Mercedes, window down, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other relaxed at his side. His expression is composed, the specific composure of someone who has been in difficult situations before and has learned through years of experience how to make calm look effortless. Moments later, a young white officer approaches the window, chest forward, hand drifting toward his belt, the manufactured authority of someone who has been on the job long enough to develop confidence, but not long enough to develop judgment. He tells the driver the vehicle matches a description and demands identification. The man in the car looks at him steadily and says he has done nothing wrong. The officer's tone sharpens, his voice climbs, and when the driver still doesn't move the way the officer wants him to move, the officer reaches toward his holster. That is when the man in the gray Mercedes reaches slowly into the pocket of his sleeveless gray shirt, produces a badge, and says 4 words that the body camera captures with the kind of audio clarity that makes subsequent denials pointless. I am your superior. What happened in the next 8 minutes would expose a department's training failure, end a rookie's career before it produced a single legitimate arrest, and become required viewing in 3 law enforcement oversight presentations before the year was over. Before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button before this video ends. Stories like this one need to be heard, and your support is what keeps them coming. September 14th started the way most Sundays start for a man who has spent 23 years making the distinction between work and rest deliberately. Captain Jamal Washington of the Charlotte Police Department had finished a late morning session at his home gym, the kind of disciplined, unglamorous routine that 23 years of early shifts and late nights had built into the architecture of his weekends without requiring a decision. He had showered, dressed in the clothes that Sunday asked for rather than the clothes his rank required, a sleeveless gray shirt that showed the tattoo running down his left forearm, dark athletic pants, a silver chain sitting at his collarbone, the quiet physical presence of a man who was off the clock and entirely comfortable being exactly that. He was 42 years old. He looked like the photograph on his body camera footage timestamp, composed, direct, the kind of face that has processed enough difficult situations to have stopped performing reactions and started simply having them. His gray-streaked hair was cut close. His eyes, when the body camera eventually captured them directly, carried the specific quality of someone who was not surprised by what was happening and was not going to pretend otherwise. He had pulled his dark gray Mercedes to the curb outside his brother's house on Fairview Lane at 2:19 p.m. His brother wasn't home yet. He cut the engine, rolled the window down, and settled into the particular patience of someone who had learned to treat waiting as productive time rather than lost time. His phone was in his right hand. His badge, the one he carried every day regardless of whether he was in uniform, because 23 years had made it as automatic as his keys, was in the left pocket of his gray shirt. He was not thinking about work. He was not performing vigilance or projecting authority or doing any of the things that 23 years of command had trained him to do in professional contexts. He was simply a man in a parked car on a Sunday afternoon, waiting for his brother, 2 minutes from relaxed. Officer Collins Parker had been with the Charlotte Police Department for 7 months. His academy evaluation described him as self-motivated, assertive in field application, and highly proactive in identifying enforcement opportunities, language that his supervising officer had written with the specific intention of sounding complimentary, and that a review board would later read with a different intention entirely. He had 2 informal counseling notations in 7 months, both related to the same pattern, described in one as tendency to escalate before exhausting de-escalation options, and in the other as demonstrates difficulty adjusting approach when initial authority is not immediately accepted. Neither notation had resulted in formal discipline, neither had been discussed with him in any sustained, documented way. He had been cleared for solo patrol 6 weeks earlier. He was running his Sunday afternoon loop on Fairview Lane when the dark gray Mercedes caught his attention. It was parked at the curb, engine off, a black male visible in the driver's seat. Parker had been half listening to dispatch traffic for the past 40 minutes. There had been a BLO earlier in the shift, a dark-colored sedan, details unspecific, reported in the broader metro area. The details were thin enough that the BLO was more category than description. Parker looked at the Mercedes and made the connection that thin details and a working assumption will always make when they find themselves in the mind of someone looking for something to act on. His dash camera footage shows him slowing as he passes the parked car, circling the block with the deliberate patience of someone building a justification and pulling up behind the Mercedes at 2:23 p.m. He radios dispatch. His voice carries the specific steadiness of performed confidence, the tone of someone who has decided they have found something and is now constructing the official record around the decision.
He steps out of his cruiser, adjusts his belt, squares his shoulders. His body camera activates. The footage shows the residential street, the afternoon light, the dark gray Mercedes at the curb, and Collins Parker walking toward the driver's window with the particular stride of a 7-month officer who has never been wrong in a way that cost him anything. That was about to change in 8 minutes, on a body camera, in front of a badge that outranked everything Parker had ever worn. Jamal Washington had spent 23 years learning when to be visible and when to let the work speak. That distinction between the performance of authority and the actual exercise of it was the most important professional lesson his career had produced, and it had not come from any training manual or academy curriculum. It had come from the specific, accumulated experience of navigating a profession where black men in command positions were measured against a standard that required constant demonstration rather than simple assumption. He had learned early that the officers who needed their rank to announce itself in every room were usually the officers whose rank was doing more work than they were. He had decided, somewhere in his 2nd year, not to be that kind of officer. 21 years of subsequent decisions had built on that one. His record reflected it. 23 years with the Charlotte Police Department, patrol, investigations, violent crimes division, a 2-year federal task force assignment that had produced 3 major prosecutions, and a directorial commendation from an agency that issued them rarely and meant it when they did. He had made captain at 38, one of the youngest in the department's history, through a promotion process that his supervising commander had described in the written recommendation as the most straightforward advancement decision he had made in 15 years of evaluating candidates. The recommendation cited judgment, institutional knowledge, and the specific quality that distinguished good commanders from exceptional ones, the ability to make the people working under them better at their jobs simply by being present and consistent. He had 2 department commendations framed in his office. He had never once mentioned them in conversation. That Sunday, none of that was on display, and none of it was meant to be. The sleeveless gray shirt showed the tattoo on his left forearm, the one he'd had since his late 20s, dark geometric work that covered the outer forearm in the kind of design that people either noticed immediately or not at all, depending on whether they were looking at him or at what they had already decided about him. The silver chain sat at his collarbone. The gray-streaked hair was cut close the way he kept it year-round, practical and undemanding. He looked like a man on a Sunday afternoon, which was precisely what he was, and he had cultivated the ability to occupy that description completely when the week allowed it. The badge was in his left shirt pocket. It was always in his left shirt pocket, not as a precaution, not as a statement, but as the 23-year habit of a man for whom carrying it had become as automatic and unremarkable as carrying his keys. He was waiting for his brother. The street was quiet. The afternoon was his. For approximately 4 more minutes. Parker had been on Fairview Lane for 11 seconds before he made the decision. Not 11 minutes of observation, not a pattern of behavior that developed over multiple passes, or a specific violation that required documentation. 11 seconds of perception, the space between perception and judgment that professional training is specifically designed to fill with process. And that 7 months of field experience had not yet taught Parker to slow down enough to use. He circled the block. The dash camera recorded the loop. Fairview Lanes approached, the Mercedes visible at the curb, Parker's cruiser slowing as it passed, then the left turn, the second left, the third, the return to Fairview from the opposite direction with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided on an action and is constructing the observational record around it rather than letting the observation produce the action. By the time he pulled up behind the Mercedes at 2:23 p.m., the decision was not being made. It had already been made. The circling was not assessment. It was preparation. He radioed dispatch with the steady, manufactured calm of someone performing competence for an audio record. Dark gray sedan, residential curb, occupied by one male. Possible bolo match. He used the word possible because possible required less justification than probable and produced the same result, backup awareness and the official notation that due diligence had been performed. Dispatch acknowledged. Parker didn't wait for the plate return. He stepped out of the cruiser with the specific body language that 7 months had built into him, belt adjusted, shoulders squared, the physical vocabulary of authority that the academy had taught and that field experience had not yet complicated with the nuance that authority actually requires to function correctly. His body camera activated as his feet hit the pavement. The footage would later show the residential street in afternoon light, the dark gray Mercedes at the curb, and Collins Parker walking toward the driver's window with the particular stride of a 7-month officer who has never been wrong in a way that cost him anything.
The lesson already present in that stride, before a word has been spoken, before a badge has been produced, before any of the next 8 minutes has had the chance to happen, is one about the difference between a stop initiated by evidence and a stop initiated by assumption dressed in procedural language. Parker had the language. He did not have the evidence. He was walking toward a 23-year veteran who knew the difference between the two better than anyone currently on Fairview Lane, and who had his badge in his shirt pocket and nowhere particular to be until his brother got home. Parker's first request for ID was almost reasonable. Almost because it arrived without the explanation that department policy required, without the articulated basis that turns a demand into a lawful instruction, and with the specific tone of someone who had already decided the nature of the interaction before the window was fully down. He asked for license and registration the way people ask for things they intend to use as a starting point rather than an end point, not to verify information, but to establish a dynamic, to see how the person in the car responded to being told what to do by someone standing outside it. Jamal Washington responded by asking why he had been stopped. It was a reasonable question. A parked car with the engine off on a residential street on a Sunday afternoon does not meet any threshold that department policy recognizes as grounds for a mandatory identification request. Washington knew this the way he knew the department's entire policy manual, not as a reference document he occasionally consulted, but as institutional knowledge built into his professional operating system through 23 years of writing, reviewing, and enforcing it. He asked the question without aggression, without volume, with the patient precision of someone who wanted the answer on the record before the conversation went any further. Parker didn't provide the answer. He repeated the request louder. This is where the power trip revealed its structure. Not in the initial approach, which could claim the defense of a misidentified bolo and 7 months of underdeveloped judgment, but here, in the decision to respond to a lawful question with increased volume rather than an articulable reason, was where Parker's conduct stopped being a mistake and started being a choice. He had been asked a direct, legitimate question by the occupant of a legally parked vehicle and had decided that his authority was better demonstrated by repetition and escalation than by explanation. Washington remained still, both hands visible, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had conducted enough field interviews to know that stillness in a moment designed to produce agitation was its own form of power. Parker stepped closer to the window. His right hand moved to his belt, not drawing, not yet, but resting there with the deliberate visibility of a gesture designed to communicate what the next step looked like if compliance didn't arrive on his timeline. The body camera captured the hand position from chest height. It captured Washington's eyes tracking the movement with the calm, clinical attention of a man cataloging what was happening rather than reacting to it. The lesson already present in this moment, before the badge comes out, before the radio call, before everything Parker had spent 7 months building starts coming apart, is about the difference between authority that explains itself and authority that replaces explanation with pressure. One of those is lawful, the other is on the body camera. And the body camera at 2:31 p.m. on September 14th was 8 minutes into recording the second kind. Jamal Washington reached into his shirt pocket slowly, not because the movement required slowness. Retrieving a badge from a shirt pocket takes approximately 2 seconds under any conditions. But 23 years of field experience had built into him the specific discipline of making every motion in a tense situation completely unambiguously legible. Visible hand, deliberate pace. Nothing that a running body camera could frame as anything other than exactly what it was. He had given that same instruction to officers under his command more times than he could count without effort. He was now demonstrating it to one of them on a Sunday afternoon on Fairview Lane. He produced the badge and opened the credential case in a single practiced motion. Gold shield, captain's designation, Charlotte Police Department seal. His name in the format that command-level credentials carry. Precise, institutional, the specific typography of authority that has been earned through a process considerably longer and more demanding than 7 months of solo patrol. He held it at window level, angled where the afternoon light caught the shield cleanly, where the body camera could read every detail from its chest-height position, where Collins Parker, standing 2 feet from the glass, had no interpretive options available to him whatsoever. He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without the satisfaction that the moment might have licensed in someone with less discipline. I am your captain. Step back from the vehicle. The body camera captured what happened to Parker in the 4 seconds following those 7 words with the kind of resolution that removes any possibility of a competing account. The hand that had been resting on the belt dropped first, not withdrawn deliberately, but falling the way a hand falls when the muscle tension that was holding it there releases all at once. The squared shoulders that had been carrying the weight of manufactured authority for 8 minutes dropped a ½ inch in the same moment. The jaw, which had been set with the specific rigidity of someone performing certainty, went slack in the precise way that certainty goes slack when the ground it was built on disappears without warning. Parker's mouth opened. Nothing came out for 2 full seconds.
The body camera recorded those 2 seconds in their entirety. The residential street, the afternoon light, the gold shield visible through the window, and a 24-year-old officer standing on a sidewalk in Charlotte trying to locate a response in a framework that had not included this outcome in any of its scenarios. Washington waited. He had the patience of someone who had seen this particular recalibration happen before and understood that rushing it produced nothing useful. He simply held the credential case open and let the information finish arriving at the speed Parker's system could process it. The lesson the footage delivers in those 4 seconds is not about rank or credentials or the specific humiliation of a power trip that ran directly into a gold shield. It is about the architecture of assumed authority, how it is constructed entirely on the expectation that the person on the receiving end of it will respond the way the framework predicts, and how completely it collapses the moment they don't. Parker had built 8 minutes of escalating pressure on a foundation that Washington's shirt pocket had just removed in 2 seconds. What was left, captured on the body camera in the afternoon light of Fairview Lane, was a 7-month officer standing in the space where his certainty used to be. Parker stepped back from the vehicle. The supervisor's cruiser turned onto Fairview Lane at 2:34 p.m. Sergeant Diana Cole had been 3 blocks away when Parker's radio transmission came through, the one where he reported a possible stolen vehicle occupied, running a check. She had been half listening the way supervisors listen to routine transmissions, filing it in the background of her Sunday afternoon patrol awareness without flagging it for immediate attention. Rookie calls in a plate, dispatch runs it, comes back clean, rookie logs it and moves on. The sequence was familiar enough to require no intervention. Then the plate came back. She had been looking at her own dashboard screen when the registration result populated, a dark gray Mercedes, registered owner listed with a department employee identifier that her 7 years of supervisory experience recognized before she finished reading the name attached to it. She read the name. She looked at Parker's last reported location. She pulled a U-turn on Meadow Street without activating her lights, because lights would have communicated urgency to the surrounding neighborhood, and urgency was not what this situation needed. What it needed was a supervisor on scene before the next 30 seconds produced something that couldn't be walked back. She covered 3 blocks in 90 seconds. What she found when she turned onto Fairview Lane was the specific tableau that the body camera had been documenting since 2:23. Parker standing on the sidewalk beside the Mercedes, the space between him and the driver's window wider than it had been in the earlier footage, his posture carrying the particular deflated quality of someone whose operational confidence has recently and completely left the premises. Washington still in the driver's seat, badge case still open on the window ledge, the afternoon light still doing nothing to soften the geometry of what she was looking at. She parked behind Parker's cruiser and stepped out without hurrying. The walk from her cruiser to the Mercedes took 11 seconds. She used all 11 of them to read the scene, the body language, the distance, the open badge case, the expression on Parker's face that she had seen on rookies before and that always meant the same thing. She reached the window and looked at him directly. She said his name and his rank in the same breath, the way you address someone when you want the acknowledgement to be visible to everyone present. Washington nodded once. His expression had not changed since Parker stepped back from the window, composed, patient, carrying the specific quality of a man who had decided to let the situation complete itself at its own pace. Cole turned to Parker. She didn't use his name. She used his unit number, the specific depersonalized address that supervisors use when they need the conversation that follows to be understood as institutional rather than personal. She said 4 words, "Give me your camera." The lesson that a supervisor's arrival delivers in moments like this one is not about rescue or intervention. Cole had not arrived in time to prevent anything. The footage was already recorded, the badge was already out, the transmission was already in the dispatch log. She had arrived in time for something different. the moment that the institution that had cleared Parker for solo patrol 6 weeks earlier was required to look directly at what that clearance had produced on a Sunday afternoon on a residential street in 8 minutes of body camera footage that was going to be reviewed by people with considerably more authority than anyone currently standing on Fairview Lane. Parker handed her the camera without speaking. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him with the expression of a supervisor who has just inherited a problem that was created before she arrived and now is entirely hers to account for.
The internal affairs investigation was opened before the end of the shift, not the following Monday, not after a preliminary review that allowed the department time to assess the situation privately before committing to a formal process. The same Sunday, because Sergeant Cole had reviewed the body camera footage in her cruiser on Fairview Lane before driving back to the precinct, and what she saw in 8 minutes of recording had removed every procedural ambiguity about whether the situation warranted formal investigation or the kind of quiet supervisory conversation that departments sometimes use to manage incidents that haven't yet reached the wrong set of eyes. This one had already reached them, Washington's eyes, and Washington had 23 years of institutional knowledge about exactly what the footage contained and exactly what the department was required to do with it. Cole filed the formal referral at 4:47 p.m. The Internal Affairs Division acknowledged receipt at 5:12. The assigned investigator had the body camera footage, the dash camera footage, the dispatch log, and Cole's written incident summary by Monday morning, a complete evidentiary package assembled in less than 18 hours before Parker had finished processing what Sunday afternoon had cost him. The investigation took 11 days. The body camera footage was the foundation that everything else was built on, and it was the kind of foundation that made the construction of a defense structurally impossible before it began. The 4K resolution captured the hand on the belt at 2:29 p.m. with the specific clarity that distinguished a resting hand from a deliberate gesture. The investigator's written report noted the distinction in a paragraph that Parker's attorney later attempted to challenge and abandoned after reviewing the same footage from 3 separate angles provided by the dash camera, the body camera, and the residential security camera mounted on the house across from where Washington had been parked. 3 angles, all recording simultaneously, all producing the same sequence. The dispatch log contributed its own layer. Parker's transmission describing a possible stolen vehicle, followed by the plate return that populated Washington's department employee identifier, followed by a gap of 4 minutes between the identifier populating and Parker calling for supervisory assistance. 4 minutes during which the body camera showed Parker escalating rather than de-escalating after information was available that should have ended the stop entirely. The investigator's report was 43 pages. Its conclusion was reached on page 31, and the remaining 12 pages were dedicated to the systemic question that Washington's attorney had formally submitted as a supplementary inquiry. Not just what Parker did, but what the department's supervision structure had failed to catch in 7 months of documented escalation pattern that 2 counseling notations had named and nothing had corrected. That question expanded the investigation beyond Parker personally. The training division's records were subpoenaed. The supervising officer who had written both counseling notations was interviewed under oath. The 6-week timeline between Parker's solo patrol clearance and the incident on Fairview Lane was reconstructed in the kind of detail that revealed, without requiring editorial commentary, that the clearance had been granted without any documented review of the counseling notations that preceded it. Parker appeared before the Internal Affairs Board on day 11. He arrived with an attorney and a prepared statement. The board chair asked him to set the statement aside and instead respond to the footage, specifically the 4-minute window between the plate identifier populating and the supervisory call. Parker's attorney objected to the framing. The board chair noted the objection and repeated the question. Parker had no answer that the footage didn't already contradict. The board's finding was unanimous. Conduct unbecoming,
abuse of authority, failure to follow department protocol governing identification requests. The recommendation was termination, with a notation in the permanent record that the department's supervision structure required immediate review, a notation that ensured the findings' consequences extended beyond one officer's personnel file and into the institutional processes that had produced him. The lesson 43 pages of investigation delivered was the same one 8 minutes of footage had already made available on a Sunday afternoon, that the absence of consequence is not the same as the absence of a record. Parker's 2 counseling notations had existed for 7 months without producing a meaningful response. The body camera had existed for 8 minutes and produced 43 pages, a unanimous board finding, and a systemic review that reached every supervisor in Parker's chain of command. The difference between the 2 outcomes was not the severity of the conduct, it was the resolution of the documentation. Parker submitted his resignation on the 12th day, not after the termination recommendation was formally executed, before it. His attorney had reviewed the board's findings, the 43 pages, the unanimous conclusion, and the systemic notation that extended the investigation's reach beyond his personnel file, and had advised him that resignation before formal termination preserved a narrow distinction in his employment record that would matter more in the years ahead than it did in the moment. Parker signed the resignation letter with the specific quietness of someone who had run out of available positions to take and was now simply executing the only remaining option.
He was 24 years old. His law enforcement career had lasted 7 months and 11 days. The department's training division review was completed 6 weeks after the board finding. It produced 17 recommendations, revised protocols for solo patrol clearance, mandatory counseling notation review before any status advancement, structured de-escalation assessment requirements, and a new supervision accountability framework that required supervisors to formally document their awareness of any officer's active counseling notations before signing off on expanded patrol responsibilities. The review was adopted in full by the department's command structure. Implementation began the following quarter. None of that undid 8 minutes on Fairview Lane, but it built something around the 8 minutes that made the next Fairview Lane harder to reach. Jamal Washington addressed the Charlotte Police Department's new recruit graduation ceremony 4 months after the incident. He had been invited by the academy director, who had read the internal affairs report and determined that the person best positioned to deliver the training division's new framework to the incoming class was the man who had lived the gap between what the framework required and what 7 months of inadequate supervision had produced. Washington stood at the podium in full dress uniform, the bars, the commendations, the 23 years of service visible on his chest in the specific, accumulated language of a career that had been built one decision at a time. He looked at the graduating class with the same direct, composed attention he had trained on Collins Parker through a car window on a Sunday afternoon, and he said the thing he had been thinking since Sergeant Cole turned onto Fairview Lane and the situation completed itself at its own pace. He said a badge was not a weapon of ego. He said it was a shield, designed to protect the people carrying it and the people encountering it simultaneously, and that the moment an officer began using it as the first rather than the second, the badge had stopped functioning as law enforcement and started functioning as something the law was designed to correct. He said the body camera was not the enemy of good policing. It was its most reliable witness, the one that had no stake in the outcome, no counseling notation to ignore, no clearance to grant without reading the file. It recorded what happened in sequence, without interpretation, and it had been doing exactly that on Fairview Lane at 2:23 p.m. on a September afternoon when a rookie with 7 months of uncorrected pattern had pulled up behind a parked Mercedes and made the last enforcement decision of his career. He said the lesson was not about rank. The lesson was not about the gold shield or the captain's designation, or the fact that the man in the gray sleeveless shirt with the tattoo on his forearm happened to have 23 years behind him.
The lesson was about what the encounter would have looked like if the man in the car had been anyone else, a contractor, a teacher, a father waiting for his brother on a Sunday afternoon, and whether the outcome of those 8 minutes would have been documented, investigated, and corrected with the same force and the same speed. He let that question sit in the auditorium for a moment without answering it, because the graduating class was going to answer it themselves every day, in every car they approached and every window they leaned into, and every decision they made in the 4 minutes between a plate returning and a supervisor being called. He stepped back from the podium. The auditorium was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone present understands will stay with them. The body camera footage from Fairview Lane is now part of the Charlotte Police Department's mandatory training curriculum. It is shown on the first day of the de-escalation module, without commentary, in its entirety. The discussion that follows, according to every instructor who has run it, begins with silence and ends with the question Washington left unanswered at the podium, the one that has no comfortable answer and is precisely that important because it doesn't. Parker's name is not mentioned in the curriculum. The footage is identified only by date and location. What matters is not who he was. What matters is what the 8 minutes show and what the department built around them to make sure the next officer standing at a car window on a Sunday afternoon had something Parker never had. A supervisor who read the file, a system that caught the pattern, and a training module that started with the question rather than the answer. If this story held you from the first body camera click to the last word at that graduation podium, if it made you think about what a badge is for, about what 7 months of uncorrected pattern costs, about what changes when the institution finally reads the file, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Jamal Washington's exist because a gold shield was in a shirt pocket on a Sunday afternoon and a body camera was running. We tell them because the people who don't have 23 years and a captain's designation deserve the same outcome when the pattern runs into them on a residential street. If you want more stories about power, accountability, and the moments when the institution was forced to answer for what it built, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a video. We post stories exposing racial profiling, police misconduct, and the people who refused to let the record stay incomplete. Every story is documented, every one matters, and we are nowhere near finished.